Louis Pasteur and the theory of disease caused by germs. Born 1822, died 1895. The conclusion that diseases are caused by microorganisms and never by demons or by miasma still did not exist just over 100 years ago. Proposed during the Renaissance by the Italian physician Fra Castorio, after whom syphilis is named, the contagion theory had its defenders during the following 2 centuries, but it failed to be definitively established. Only in the second half of the 19th century did this situation begin to change, not only through the isolated observations of doctors, but also through the systematic work of characters such as the British surgeon Joseph Lister. But the science of bacteriology, which became an immense success, is generally credited with the genius of Louis Pasteur. Although recent scholarship has placed Pasteur on an almost divine level, like Freud, he was revered beyond measure, it is difficult to deny the fame already achieved during his lifetime that he belongs to the group of the great scientists of history. With a degree in chemistry, his initial interest was crystallography, but he soon turned to practical studies on the diseases of the fermentation of vinegar, wine, and beer, and then to studies on infections that afflicted human beings and animals. He then developed vaccines against anthrax and rabies and gave rise to many successful researches in the fight against a number of other diseases. Pasteur's exceptional ability to extract a general theory from his discoveries led to significant innovations in medicine. Immediately, they saved millions of lives, generating profound changes in people's daily lives. It is not surprising, therefore, that he gained legendary fame even in his time, and that today, even with a more critical attitude towards the great figures of science, his achievements are being the subject of more intense investigations. Louis Pasteur was born on December 27, 1822, in Dole, eastern France. His father, Joseph Pasteur, a sergeant in Napoleon's army and a leather tanner by trade, had a strong positive influence on him. In his youth, Louis was a promising painter. The canvases, still extant, reveal his talent, but he abandoned his artistic pretensions at the age of 19 to pursue a scientific career. Following his graduation from the Collège in Besançon, he and his family decided that he would continue his studies in Paris at the École Normale Supérieure, which was at the time, and still is today, the trainer of university teachers in arts and sciences. It is so typical of his diligence and perfectionism, of his selfishness and eccentricity, that Pasteur, in 1842, when he obtained a low score in the selection exams, even a grade of mediocre in chemistry, even refused to enroll. He studied for another year and took a new exam, enrolling after his grades placed him above the others. He studied physics and chemistry, becoming a professor when he passed through the agrégation in 1846. The following year, he defended 2 theses, one in physics and the other in chemistry.
Pasteur's first discovery came in 1848 in crystallography, then a very fashionable field, showing his powers of persistence and observation, as well as his ability to formulate a general theory. Chemists were intrigued by the fact that certain crystals formed by tartrates were chemically the same but with different optical properties. That is, some deflected light and others did not. The term isomers had been coined by J.J. Berzelius to describe compounds of equal parts, but without making it clear how this happened. By using manual tweezers with lenses and through tedious and extremely precise research, Pasteur was able to demonstrate that the 2 crystal shapes were, in reality, reflected images of each other. According to legend, Pasteur's solution to this mystery led him to shout what became his best-known quote, "Tout est trouvé." He had solved, as he showed, not only the structure of tartaric acid, but also discovered dissymmetric molecules, an entirely new class of substances. And the study of this arrangement of molecular structure, which affects the properties of a chemical compound, came to be called stereochemistry.
In 1854,
Pasteur accepted the chair of chemistry at the University of Lille, where he turned his interest to the study of fermentation at the request of a local industrialist who could not understand why certain batches of beet juice did not convert into ethyl alcohol. In studying the problem, Pasteur expanded his investigation to include lactic and alcoholic fermentation as well. It was known that the production of alcohol from sugar was caused by fermentation, a position defended by Justus Liebig, 36, and other famous chemists of the time. Pasteur, however, came to a very different conclusion. Fermentation is a biological process based on the multiplication of yeast. In 1857, he published a short article entitled Mémoire sur la fermentation appelée, considered to be one of the cornerstones of microbiology. Although Pasteur's theory has some inaccuracies, this article was quite eclectic, suggesting that there is a category of creatures whose respiration is active enough to obtain oxygen from certain compounds that are subject to a slow and progressive decomposition. Pasteur had discovered anaerobic organisms, as well as providing the scientific basis for a process that had been used for centuries. The industrial use of yeasts today includes the production of food and alcohol, and also the manufacture of vitamins, antibiotics, and hormones. Upon returning to Paris in 1857, Pasteur became director of scientific studies at the École Normale. The study of fermentation raised for Pasteur the problem of spontaneous generation, the old belief that certain forms of life arise from where there is no life. This highly plausible notion, earthworms and flies, for example, emerge from the soil, was consistently overturned by organic chemistry. Pasteur then performed a variety of ingenious experiments. He showed that atmospheric air always contains microorganisms, and that living beings can always be found in substances such as sugar water when exposed to oxygen. By contrast, he repeatedly demonstrated that substances susceptible to putrefaction and fermentation could not sustain life without air. He heated glass jars with high necks, and the organisms did not appear after boiling, and until air was introduced. At one point, Pasteur went to the Jura Mountains, climbed Mount Poupée, and opened his flasks, showing that these regions were relatively uncontaminated. According to René Dubos, after Pasteur did his research, there was no longer any reason to believe that spontaneous generation would ever happen, at least under normal conditions. Over the course of a decade, beginning around 1863, Louis Pasteur and his theories produced a tremendous impact on French industry, and his fame became international. Still, in 1863, by directive of Napoleon III, he began a study on the diseases of wines, which, for unknown reasons, sometimes turned into vinegar or became bitter or even deteriorated. Pasteur showed that bacterial decomposition was responsible for these effects, and although he initially considered introducing an antiseptic into wine, he found that heat treatment would be a more viable solution, and in fact, a method already employed by peasants in some parts of Spain and elsewhere. After France's defeat to Germany in 1871, Pasteur applied similar principles to the study of beer, a gesture then considered not very patriotic. Pasteurization, the heating of beer or wine for a short period to 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, was soon applied to a number of foods, especially milk and its derivatives.
Diseases of silkworms were another of Pasteur's concerns during the 1860s, and he managed to save the French silk weaving mill from catastrophe by controlling the reproduction process, aimed at avoiding contaminated eggs. When he reached the apex of his career in 1873, his 20-year work on immunology on infectious diseases began to be followed very closely by an ever-growing number of admirers. In 1880, Pasteur laid his first sketch to create a vaccine, after having isolated the organism that causes cholera in birds. However, to avoid confrontation, he kept to himself the discoveries that culminated in the formulation of this vaccine, developed simply by weakening the microbe when exposed to air. He then concluded that the reduction in the potency of that organism could be responsible for a situation of immunity in the animal after an inoculation. Thus, Pasteur, recognizing this formulation as the general principle of immunity, begins the most important and resounding phase of his life.
Pasteur's success with poultry cholera led him to tackle the problem of anthrax, a disease that afflicted livestock and was transmitted to humans. By carrying out an impressive investigation, Pasteur arrived at the microbe responsible for it, suggesting that it would be transmitted by the carcasses of animals buried in the pastures. Even more resounding was the demonstration made in public in 1881 of his anthrax vaccine, and which he said was prepared with the attenuated virus. By infecting 50 sheep with a virulent culture, all 25 animals that had not been first inoculated with the vaccine died. This controversial experiment that Pasteur had been challenged to demonstrate was carried out with great skill and widely reported. Pasteur's experiments in immunology, then incipient, culminated in the famous rabies vaccine developed during the 1880s. Due to the dramatic symptoms and ultimate mortality, rabies was a particularly unfathomable and frightening disease. In the laboratory, Pasteur was able to protect dogs by injecting an attenuated form of the culture, followed by inoculation with a high virulence culture. He had not yet tested the vaccine on humans and was not tempted to do so until a boy, Joseph Meister, was brought in 1885 after being bitten by a rabid dog. Since it was assumed that the boy was lost without the vaccine, Pasteur, and not without reluctance, made a series of inoculations. The young Meister survived, and Pasteur was covered in glory. This ultimate success allowed Pasteur to raise funds through public subscription to build the medical institute that now bears his name. Louis Pasteur married Marie Laurent in 1849, and they had 4 children, 2 of whom reached adulthood. Viewed seriously, like other great scientists and their works, Pasteur does not confirm the statements made by his first biographers. Recently, Gerald L. Geisen, in an exceptional work, documented how Pasteur's anthrax vaccine depended not on attenuation, as he said, but on a technique developed by a rival. And similar disappointments also exist with regard to his rabies vaccine. Acknowledging that Pasteur's scientific work was of enormous importance and fertility, and that some of his principles continued to guide us even today, Geisen tried to empty the unnecessary aspects of what is known as the Pasteurian legend. That image was made in a context that has lost much of its meaning for us, a context in which heroic biographies were used to convey widely accepted moral truths, and in which science was seen as directly useful and positive knowledge. Even in an age that needs and seeks heroes, we no longer have to accept that image as it appears at first glance.
In 1868, Pasteur suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. He died at St. Cloud on September 28, 1895, and was buried with honors as head of state and national hero. He is buried, with his wife, in a crypt now open to the public at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. We are not at all surprised to learn of an enormous capacity for work and an exceptional memory like that of Pasteur. Of greater importance, however, was its power to combine the ability to perceive details with the faculty of generalizing, coupled with comprehensiveness and precision. This ability, which can be perceived by the breadth and clarity of his works, he shares with Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Charles Darwin, and Sigmund Freud. Like many of these characters, he also has his less pleasant side. He had minor hostilities with Claude Bernard. He was a pious patriot and a devout Catholic who refused to consider Darwinism.
But these defects are minimal in the face of what Jacques Nicole calls his exceptional talent for incidental observations that open up subject after subject for future work, in the same way that a river irrigates large areas of land without losing its way to the sea.